When we go through our day-to-day lives, we're usually just too busy finishing up the many items on our to-do list, from the basics of living, like taking care of some, our personal hygiene, getting access to basic necessities like food and water, completing at least the minimum for work, school, whatever else we're committing ourselves to. When we aren't busy fulfilling our responsibilities, we are usually consuming something as a way of enjoying or maybe escaping life, whether it's social life, buying something shiny and new, obsessing over some celebrity gossip. I don't know. I don't know what you do in your spare time. Just fill the blank here with whatever it is that you do with your free time, right? Yet, when we step back and ask what it's all for, all these daily tasks and all the things we do to occupy ourselves may start to seem fairly meaningless, right? And all the things that we get excited about just honestly in the long term, perspective. Like I'm talking like in the entire and considering the entirety of your life or across generations, a lot of the things that we tend to care about doesn't seem all that important when we take this sort of bird's eye view. Am I really, for instance, doing all this work just to do more work, to buy more stuff, to continue existing? All this to just die at some point? What's the point of caring so much about, the latest fashion trend, let's say, when all these trends eventually die and get resurrected at some later point and we just go around and around in a circle? Why have kids that'll eventually have kids, all of them to just go down the inevitable path of just dying at some point, right? What's the point of any of this? What's the point of living, right? Now, some of you might immediately respond to such a, dreadful kind of perspective and think that you have the answer, that life is meaningful in the time that you are living, that it's something about the relationship that you have or the knowledge that we build as a community or the way that you grow and experience certain things and cultivate certain virtues through your years. Surely my life feels very meaningful, doesn't it? But that's exactly the point. We believe lives at least some lives, maybe not all. We believe that human lives to some degree are meaningful. They're worth living, right? But without reflection on what it is that gives life meaning or, I don't know, maybe a sense of purpose, we are doing nothing more than just spewing feelings or vibes, which may be true, but may also just be mere delusions we created for ourselves to keep ourselves going every day. All right. There's a real possibility that our life is meaningless, that it's nonsensical. We may have felt that way at times, and we do things to turn away from it and give our life meaning, right? I mean, look, you wouldn't have goals unless you thought that there was a reason to have those goals, that those goals were that they meant something to you, right? But what happens when all those goals no longer exist, right? It leaves you wondering why it is that we find lives meaningful and meaningless at times, and sometimes in ourselves and sometimes in others. Why we might say that some people's lives were more meaningful than others, right? And I'm guessing that the answer to these questions matter to you since you're the one who's living this meaningful or meaningless life. That there's a difference between the meaningful and meaningless life becomes fairly evident when you play the comparison game, right? Like, look, I'm thinking of like certain kinds of lives that, when I look at it, I try not to be judgy, but it's hard for me to see certain lives as particularly meaningful. Like I'm thinking of lives specifically like the following, right? Like a person who spends all day doing nothing except watching endless reruns of terrible, terrible soap operas and eating Hot Pockets and Cheetos, only to eventually die without any relationships, without any meaningful impact on the larger world. Maybe they just didn't even work, right? They didn't engage with other people. They just, they were just living off of some trust fund that was left on their behalf, right? Or, I'm also thinking of a person who dedicated their life to what might seem like a meaningful cause. Let's say, like cancer research and wanting to develop a cure for cancer. And they pursued this at the cost of relationships, at the cost of, you know, other sorts of pursuits that other people might have had, only to find that their research did not pan out. I'm not just talking like, look, they didn't find a cure, but then they developed all kinds of interesting techniques that were later used for, like, I'm not talking like that. Like, their research produced absolutely nothing. It didn't rule out certain possibilities. It didn't help, develop some important information that was used later on. They didn't contribute to the overall body of scientific knowledge on cancer. It just had zero impact, right? I mean, there's something about that life that seems fairly meaningless to me, right? I'm guessing the person themselves might have questioned their life goals. They did all they could. They pursued something that they thought was meaningful, and at the end of the day, they have absolutely nothing to show for it. And then they might start asking themselves the question, why did I do all this? Why did I waste all this time and energy only to produce absolutely nothing? I'm thinking of the kind of people who, let's say they think that they're impacting the world with their Instagram stories, only to have, I don't know, maybe zero followers, or maybe the followers they have do absolutely nothing except doom scroll all day. So they aren't really like, it didn't have any impact on their lives or didn't move them to do anything. Each of these lives that I'm describing, um, you know, I'm assuming like, look, they themselves might be wanting a meaningful life, right? But I'm assuming that people who want to really have a meaningful life would not want these sorts of lives, generally speaking. And it's important for us to kind of reflect on why it is that we find some of these lives to be fairly empty. It becomes clear that we do have some standards for what constitutes a meaningful life, that it's not just whatever you yourself find meaningful makes it a meaningful life, right? You could argue that each of these people may have found something that they valued in what they were doing, but something about their life seems to be missing something important, right? It seems to matter. Like, forget what you think about your own life, right? It seems to matter whether or not a person's life has some sort of impact on the world or others or themselves, right? It has some sort of impact, right? Like, zero impact seems to be a bad thing, seems to take away something meaningful about that person's life. Similarly, forming deep, meaningful relationships seems to matter, right? That the a danger of being circular here, right? But like, look, relationships of a certain kind seem to not be all that meaningful, right? Like, what kind of relationship am I thinking? I'm thinking of like the online ones with complete strangers that you don't share anything deep or personal about yourselves with. Like, it's just a person that you regularly chat with about, I don't know, like the day, like you have small talk and then, that's it. Doesn't seem all that meaningful. But deep relationships that you forge with friends that are intimate, with family members, with, romantic partners, right? These seem to carry a kind of weight that other relationships don't. You might even think that developing yourself in some ways and not devolving, wasting your ability by just, watching soap operas and eating Cheetos all day, like that seems to matter. These things seem to matter. Look, more importantly, is that I'm not sure if humans are designed to live a meaningless life. The very idea that you are fine with just living a meaningless life honestly would raise a lot of questions, at least for me, about your mental health. I would wonder, right, whether you had certain kinds of experience that has sucked the life out of you, right? Like the animating force within you is just dead, right? There's something about a life that is wanting to wake up, face challenges, do something with the day, care for others, make an impact, right? Like develop something, be useful. These things all seem to be part of what makes life worth living. And people who don't find any sort of desire to do any of that, it sounds like depression. I'm not gonna lie, it sounds kind of like depression, right? It sounds like there's probably a lot of deep-seated something going on that needs to be worked through, maybe in therapy, or maybe it's a medical thing. I don't know. All right, but a life that you don't find any meaning in, honestly, it just doesn't seem like a life that you yourself would find worth living. So what do I mean? By all talking about all this, right? Like, what am I trying to get at? I'm trying to get at the following, right? Which is, look, we all want to live meaningful lives. And if we're not lying to ourselves and to others, it does seem as if they're in the background, maybe not explicitly, maybe not something you thought about and reflected on, but in the background, there's at least something that is guiding your decision making to formulating, a life for yourself, creating a life for yourself that you yourself find to be meaningful, right? And if you don't actually reflect on it, then you're just going around doing stuff. You're just trying things out. I find that, people are wanting to find meaning in their lives. I think it's a hard thing to do. And I think it's made even harder when you're flying blind, when you don't know what it is that you're doing and you're just trying stuff out. And you're letting whether or not it feels good in the moment dictate whether or not you decide it's meaningful. I think when we slow down, take a step back, and start looking at not just our own lives, but the many lives that are lived, and we start seeing a continuity in what we find to be the kind of lives that you might want to emulate for yourself, right? Kind of lives you want to, serve as a guiding light for what kinds of things, at least in theory, what kinds of things you want to accomplish for yourself. You begin to gain greater clarity on your own life and what makes your own life meaningful. I imagine that there are a lot of commonalities for most people. Maybe not in substance, but in terms of the general framework for what makes a life meaningful. But I also find that when we don't have these discussions out loud, because we want to let everybody find their own meaning, right? Then I think we lose something. We lose our ability to be able to gain clarity for ourselves on what it is that we really do find meaning in. We lose clarity on our own purpose. So I hope that we can have this sort of discussion out loud, and not from a place of judging one another, but rather as a way for us to kind of explore alongside one another the very things that seem to build a meaningful life for ourselves, and to take from others' experience and the things that drive them, the things that they pursue, the things that bring them some sort of deeper joy or sense of content or whatever else it might be, that you at least start to have a little bit more clarity for yourself on how it is that you want to shape your life to becoming the kind of life that you want to wake up every day and want to live.